a small hand wrapped around expensive Italian wool on a Tuesday afternoon, and every weapon within 20 feet moved toward holsters before a single finger rose to freeze them all. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, her lavender dress catching autumn light outside Roosevelt Elementary, while dismissal chaos swirled around them like water around stone. Soren's eyes dropped to the small fingers creasing fabric that cost more than most families spent on rent, taking in the chipped polish on tiny nails and the tremor she was trying to hide. The schoolyard sounds seemed to dim as he registered her face, tear-streaked but resolute, chin raised in defiance of every survival instinct screaming at her to run. The suited men flanking him registered the breach of protocol with visible tension, hands hovering near concealed firearms, while parents collecting children pretended not to notice the expensive cars idling at the curb. She didn't wait for permission to speak, words tumbling out in a rush that suggested she'd rehearsed them during the entire walk across the playground. His security detail had protocols for this: unauthorized contact, potential threat assessment, immediate extraction if necessary. But something in the girl's trembling stance froze those protocols mid-execution, her desperation communicating louder than any threat-level classification system his men had been trained to recognize. The renovation project behind them represented 18 months of careful image construction, every press release calculated to position him as community benefactor, rather than the predator most people suspected. Local politicians had posed for photographs, nonprofit directors had praised his civic commitment, and now this child was dismantling that facade with accusations that carried the weight of witnessed truth. Parents were slowing their departure now, cell phones appearing in hands as people calculated whether this moment warranted documentation. His driver shifted position near the vehicle, ready to create barrier between the scene and potential recording devices, but Soren's slight headshake communicated that containment would draw more attention than allowing the encounter to unfold naturally. The girl's lavender dress had a small tear near the hem, recently mended with stitches that didn't quite match the original thread. Details like this told stories that economic reports never captured: the careful maintenance of limited resources, the pride that persisted despite financial constraints, the visible evidence of poverty that America preferred to ignore rather than address. "Your guys came to our building," she said, each word precise despite the quiver in her lower lip. "They were yelling and breaking things, and my sister got scared." The pause stretched long enough for a school bell to ring in the distance, for a teacher to call out about forgotten backpacks. Her voice carried despite its smallness, cutting through the afternoon air with accusation that made 2 of his men exchange uncomfortable glances. "She ran away and she can't talk and nobody can find her, and it's because of your men." The renovation trucks parked along the street suddenly felt like evidence at a crime scene, their presence now carrying weight that hadn't existed moments before. Soren's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in the air around him, a subtle recalibration that his security detail recognized immediately as the moment before decisions became irreversible. He lowered himself to one knee on the concrete sidewalk, bringing his face level with hers while ignoring the dirt that would ruin the pressed line of his trousers. Up close, he could see the lavender fabric was worn thin at the seams, see the way her small chest heaved with fear she was converting into courage. The school behind them represented millions in donations he'd funneled through legitimate channels, every dollar calculated to transform his reputation from predator to philanthropist in public perception. Teachers knew his name as a benefactor. Administrators praised his commitment to education. Local news had photographed him turning the first shovel of dirt for the new gymnasium. Now this child was tearing down that carefully constructed facade with nothing but truth and a handful of expensive fabric. "What's your sister's name?" His voice emerged quiet enough that she had to lean forward slightly to hear, quiet enough that the bodyguards couldn't catch the words. The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd expected denial or dismissal, or the kind of adult deflection that children learn to recognize early. Her grip loosened fractionally on his jacket. The name emerged as barely more than a whisper, carrying weight that spoke of years protecting someone more vulnerable than herself. "She's 12, but she doesn't talk, and loud noises make her hide." Her eyes searched his face for something. Belief, perhaps, or the kind of recognition that confirms you've been heard rather than simply listened to. Soren's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that his driver caught and cataloged from 15 feet away. 2 days ago, he'd sent 3 collectors to handle a delinquent tenant in a building 4 blocks from here, a building currently under renovation as part of his expansion into legitimate real estate holdings. The irony tasted like copper. He was trying to clean up neighborhoods while his own people were terrorizing the residents he claimed to protect. The girl's hand finally released his jacket, leaving tiny wrinkles in the perfect fabric that would require professional pressing. She stepped back exactly 1 pace, maintaining eye contact in a way that most adults in his sphere couldn't manage without flinching. He recognized the body language of someone preparing to run, while simultaneously refusing to show fear, the particular tension that comes from knowing you've crossed a line, but believing the cause justified the risk. Behind her, the school parking lot was emptying as the last buses pulled away with diesel rumbles and squealing brakes. A teacher paused near the entrance, watching their interaction with obvious concern, but uncertain whether to intervene when expensive suits and luxury vehicles suggested complications beyond her pay grade. Movement at the periphery caught his attention. A woman in faded scrubs running across the playground, with the kind of panic that transcends exhaustion. Her features carried the hollowed-out look of someone who'd missed too many meals to afford groceries, who'd worked double shifts until the body protested, but the bills demanded more. Bryn's hands reached for her daughter before words could form, pulling Fern back with a grip that bordered on painful in its desperation. Apologies tumbled from her lips in fragmented bursts, each one landing like a plea for mercy that she didn't expect to receive but couldn't stop herself from offering. The medical scrubs she wore carried institutional smell of disinfectant and long shifts, the fabric worn thin at stress points where repeated washing had broken down fibers. Her name tag was slightly crooked, pinned hastily during what had probably been frantic preparation for a shift that would now be missed, because crisis didn't respect employment schedules or the consequences of unexcused absences. Soren's men had already run preliminary identification through systems that most civilians didn't know existed. No outstanding warrants, no criminal history, employment records showing pattern of reliability, interrupted only by documented family emergencies. The data painted picture of someone struggling within legal boundaries, someone who followed rules even when rules didn't protect her. The permission slip in her hand was for a field trip that had happened 2 weeks ago, kept perhaps as proof of normal life continuing despite chaos. Schools generated endless paperwork that poor families collected like talismans: vaccination records, emergency contact forms, free lunch applications, each document representing another bureaucratic hurdle cleared in the exhausting marathon of raising children while poor. Fern had positioned herself partially in front of her mother, despite being pulled backward, small body instinctively creating shield, even though logic suggested a 7-year-old couldn't protect an adult from men with guns. The gesture spoke to family dynamics forged in crisis, where traditional parent-child hierarchies had been complicated by shared survival requirements. Soren rose to his full height in a single fluid motion, his shadow falling across both of them as the afternoon sun shifted position. He watched the mother position herself between him and the child, watched the way her body trembled while her stance remained protective and absolute. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, she didn't mean..." The words dissolved into something close to hyperventilation, fear overriding the careful control that Bryn had clearly been maintaining until this moment. Her scrubs bore the logo of a medical facility on the east side, the kind of place that paid minimum wage for maximum exposure to human suffering. Recognition flashed across his face with the precision of tumblers clicking into place within a lock. The address was visible on a school permission slip, clutched in her shaking hand. The same building where his collectors operated with the casual brutality that came from knowing no one would complain. "Your daughter says someone is missing." His voice carried no inflection, no judgment, just the flat statement of fact that he used in negotiations, where every word held potential consequences. The mother's eyes widened, darting between his face and the men flanking him with obvious calculation about which direction offered the best escape route. Bryn's throat worked soundlessly for 3 full seconds before words emerged. "My older daughter. She has special needs. She can't speak. And when your men came..." The sentence fractured under the weight of what she was admitting, the dangerous truth that she was accusing him directly of responsibility. When was this? The question came sharp and immediate, cutting through her spiral of panic with the kind of authority that demanded answers rather than excuses. His phone was already in his hand, thumb hovering over a contact that would mobilize resources most people didn't know existed. Yesterday afternoon, they came for Mr. Herrera in 3B. They were shouting about money, breaking his door. Bryn's words came faster now, as if speed could somehow protect her from the vulnerability of confession. She was in the hallway, she saw them, and she just ran. Soren's expression remained carefully neutral, but his free hand gestured minutely to the driver, who immediately moved toward the nearest vehicle. The collectors in question had been following standard protocol for debt collection in properties he controlled, which meant they'd been operating with the assumption that intimidation was not just acceptable, but expected. How long has she been gone? The phone was already at his ear, the call connecting with the kind of instantaneous response that spoke to hierarchies where his voice carried weight that couldn't be ignored or delayed. Behind him, engines started with synchronized precision. 26 hours. The specificity of Bryn's answer revealed the torture of counting every minute, of watching clocks while imagining worst-case scenarios that probably didn't come close to the actual dangers a mute 12-year-old girl faced alone in Spokane after dark. Fern's hand found her mother's, small fingers interlacing with calloused ones in a gesture of solidarity that seemed far too mature for 7 years old. She hadn't cried yet, hadn't broken down despite the obvious terror thrumming through her small frame, and Soren recognized that particular brand of control as the kind born from necessity rather than choice. Get in the car. It wasn't a request, and the way Bryn's body went rigid suggested she understood the difference. I need the building address, apartment number, and a recent photograph if you have one. The mother's hesitation lasted exactly as long as it took her to calculate whether compliance or flight offered better odds of survival. Her shoulders sagged in surrender. That looked like defeat, but was actually the opposite. The conscious choice to trust a dangerous man, because all other options had already failed. Soren opened the rear door of the black sedan himself, a gesture that made his security detail exchange glances heavy with unspoken questions. Parents still lingering in the parking lot would talk about this moment for weeks, would speculate about the woman and child entering a vehicle that screamed organized crime with every polished inch of its exterior. Bryn clutched Fern's hand as they moved toward the open door, her free hand fishing a battered phone from her scrub pocket. The screen was cracked but functional, displaying a photo that she pulled up with muscle memory that spoke to how many times she'd looked at that image in the past 26 hours. Building 7 on Morrow Street, apartment 4C. Her voice steadied slightly with the recitation of concrete details, facts that couldn't betray emotion or weakness. She's 12, 4'9", brown hair past her shoulders. She was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. Soren's fingers moved across his phone screen with surgical precision, messages dispatching to contacts whose names never appeared in any official documentation. 2 vehicles pulled up within 90 seconds, their arrival choreographed with the efficiency of people who understood that speed could mean the difference between recovery and tragedy. Inside the sedan, Fern sat pressed against her mother's side, while Bryn's fingers wouldn't stop moving, smoothing her daughter's hair, checking the seatbelt, touching her own phone as if the action might somehow summon her missing child. The leather interior smelled like expensive cologne and gun oil, scents that seemed to amplify rather than mask the danger they'd willingly entered. Traffic parted around them with the ease that money and intimidation provided, other drivers instinctively recognizing vehicles that shouldn't be challenged or delayed. The route to Morrow Street cut through neighborhoods where Spokane's economic stratification became visible. Pristine downtown blocks giving way to areas where payday loan stores outnumbered grocery stores and bus stops served as community gathering spaces because actual community centers had been defunded years ago. Bryn's phone buzzed repeatedly with messages she didn't check, probably her supervisor demanding explanation for the no-show that would likely cost her the job she'd mentioned. Each vibration made her flinch slightly, body registering additional crisis even as her mind remained focused on the primary emergency of a missing daughter, who couldn't call for help even if she found a phone. Fern's small hand had found the door handle and was gripping it with white-knuckled intensity, as if maintaining physical connection to exit strategy provided comfort, even though opening the door while moving would solve nothing. Her eyes tracked every street sign, every landmark, mapping the route in case she needed to retrace it later. Survival instinct that children in unstable situations developed early and never quite unlearned. The second vehicle following them carried men whose specific roles remained undefined, but whose presence communicated that this operation had resources most missing person cases never received. Police wouldn't mobilize this quickly, wouldn't dedicate this many personnel, wouldn't treat a missing 12-year-old from a low-income building as priority worth immediate action, but Soren's organization operated outside bureaucratic constraints that made official systems slow and often useless. Soren slid into the front passenger seat, his driver already pulling away from the curb before the door fully closed. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the mother's face cycle through expressions that she was trying desperately to control, hope warring with terror, gratitude battling suspicion. The men who came to your building, describe them. His voice remained level, clinical, the tone of someone collecting data rather than assigning blame. Behind them, the second vehicle fell into formation, blocking any potential tail with practiced ease that suggested this wasn't their first extraction from a public location. Bryn's description emerged in fragments punctuated by sharp intakes of breath. Tall, one with a scar through his eyebrow, another wearing a college ring, the third with tattoos visible above his collar when he'd reached for Mr. Herrera's doorframe. The details aligned with 3 specific men in his organization, individuals he'd personally assigned to collections in that district, because they had a reputation for efficiency, without unnecessary violence. Apparently, that reputation needed revision, or perhaps the definition of unnecessary required examination when a mute child became collateral damage. She hides when she's scared. Fern's voice emerged small, but determined from the back seat, her first words since entering the vehicle. Under things or behind things, places that are dark and small where she feels safe. Soren absorbed this information with a slight nod, his mind already constructing search parameters that would focus on enclosed spaces rather than open areas. Most missing person protocols started with parks and streets, public places where lost children might wander seeking help. But a child who couldn't speak and feared loud noises would follow different patterns entirely. The driver navigated Spokane's streets with the confidence of someone who knew every alley and shortcut, who understood traffic patterns in a way that transcended legal driving. They covered 4 blocks in less than 3 minutes, pulling up outside a building that desperately needed the renovation Soren had promised when he acquired the property 6 months ago. Scaffolding wrapped the exterior like a cage, renovation materials stacked under tarps that flapped in the afternoon breeze. The building housed 42 units, most occupied by families who paid rent in cash and asked no questions about the ownership structure that kept their housing technically affordable. Before the car fully stopped, Soren's phone illuminated with incoming messages, coordinates, search grid assignments, personnel deployment confirmations. His organization moved with the precision of military operations because many of them had military backgrounds, skills repurposed from government service into private enterprise that operated outside legal constraints. Stay in the vehicle until I signal otherwise. He directed this at Bryn without turning around, his hand already on the door handle. The mother started to protest, maternal instinct overriding self-preservation, but Fern's small hand on her arm created pause enough for reason to intervene. Men emerged from the second vehicle, fanning out with practiced efficiency that transformed the street into a search grid within seconds. They moved without obvious weapons, but every resident watching from windows understood the implicit threat in their coordinated movements, their silent communication, their absolute focus. Soren approached the building entrance where a third vehicle had already disgorged 2 more of his people, one carrying equipment that looked like construction tools but served purposes that had nothing to do with renovation. The super appeared in the doorway, recognition and fear competing for dominance across his weathered features. Building sweep. Every storage unit, maintenance closet, crawl space, and access point. The orders came quiet but absolute, the kind of directive that allowed no room for interpretation or delay. She's 12, mute, traumatized, hiding. She won't respond to voices, won't come when called. One of his men nodded, already moving toward the basement access with bolt cutters that would make short work of any locks. Another headed for the roof, understanding that vertical spaces often provided the kind of isolation a frightened child might seek. Bryn had ignored his directive to stay put, emerging from the sedan with Fern attached to her side like a small shadow in lavender. He should have anticipated this. Maternal desperation overrode even the most obvious danger, and she'd already demonstrated willingness to risk everything by approaching him at the school. 4th floor? He didn't waste energy on reprimand, just adjusted his strategy to accommodate variables that refused to be controlled. Bryn nodded, already moving toward the entrance with the kind of determination that suggested she'd search every inch of this building with her bare hands if necessary. The basement smelled like decades of water damage and forgotten belongings, air thick with dust that caught in throats and made breathing deliberate. Soren's men moved through the corridors with flashlights that cut geometric patterns through darkness, methodically checking each storage cage while residents peered from doorways with the wariness of people accustomed to authority meaning trouble. Bryn's voice carried down the stairwell, calling a name that would never receive verbal response, but might register as familiar sound to a frightened child. Fern remained pressed against her mother's leg, small hand gripping worn scrub fabric, while her eyes tracked every shadow with the hypervigilance of someone who understood danger, lived in unexpected places. The building's layout revealed itself as a warren of converted spaces, where original architecture had been modified repeatedly over decades. What should have been simple corridor access had become maze-like, with storage units added wherever space allowed, and maintenance areas tucked behind walls that didn't appear on any official floor plan. Electrical wiring ran exposed along ceiling corners where previous renovations had prioritized speed over code compliance, creating fire hazards that inspectors had probably noted and landlords had probably ignored. Water stains marked walls in patterns that suggested chronic leaks rather than isolated incidents, the kind of deferred maintenance that slowly destroyed buildings while maximizing short-term profit for owners who didn't live in the properties they controlled. Some storage units had padlocks that looked newer than others, suggesting recent tenant turnover, or perhaps theft problems that made people upgrade security for possessions they couldn't afford to replace. The basement floor was uneven, settling that had occurred over decades, creating slight slopes where water would pool during the heavy rains that Spokane experienced each spring. Residents who'd emerged to watch the search maintained careful distance, their body language communicating desire to help tempered by learned caution about involving themselves in situations involving men with obvious authority and unclear intentions. An elderly man in a bathrobe held a baseball bat that he probably kept near his door, protection against break-ins that were common in buildings where security systems consisted of cheap locks, and the hope that thieves would choose easier targets. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the basement's interior, away from the stairwell where outside air occasionally circulated. This was space that existed primarily in winter, where pipes ran and furnaces operated, and maintenance happened only when absolute failure forced intervention. The invisible infrastructure that kept buildings marginally functional, while remaining perpetually one disaster away from complete collapse. Soren's phone buzzed with systematic updates. Roof clear, second-floor storage clear, laundry room clear. Each negative report narrowed possibilities while simultaneously amplifying urgency, because a 12-year-old girl couldn't survive indefinitely without water, without warmth, without the basic necessities that most people took for granted. The man with bolt cutters paused outside a storage unit at the corridor's end, one marked with a faded number that barely remained legible through layers of institutional paint. The lock appeared rusted shut, suggesting years without access, but recent scratches around the mechanism told different story to anyone trained to read such details. Here. The single word carried enough weight that everyone in the basement shifted focus immediately. Soren moved toward the unit, while gesturing for Bryn and Fern to maintain distance, because he'd learned that what they found behind locked doors wasn't always suitable for witnesses, especially young ones. Metal screamed against metal as the bolt cutters did their work, the sound echoing through basement corridors in a way that made several residents retreat quickly into their apartments. The lock fell away with a clatter that seemed disproportionately loud in the contained space, and the door swung open on hinges that protested with rust and disuse. Darkness inside was absolute, the kind of black that existed in spaces without windows or ventilation. Flashlight beams swept across piled furniture covered in sheets gray with accumulated dust, boxes stacked precariously against walls, the detritus of lives abandoned or temporarily stored and then forgotten over years of changing tenants. Behind a dresser tipped on its side, wedged into a space barely large enough for her thin frame, they found her. She'd constructed a nest from old curtains and what looked like someone's abandoned winter coat, her body curled into fetal position, with hands pressed over ears in permanent defense against sounds that had stopped hours ago. Her eyes were open but unseeing, pupils dilated in a way that suggested she'd retreated somewhere internal where external reality couldn't reach. No visible injuries marked her skin, but the kind of damage she'd sustained wouldn't show on surface examination. It would manifest in nightmares and triggers, and the slow erosion of whatever fragile trust she'd managed to construct in a world that had proven repeatedly unsafe. Soren holstered his phone and moved forward with deliberate slowness, understanding that sudden movements would only deepen her terror. He'd seen this before in war zones, in people who'd survived things that broke fundamental assumptions about safety and civilization, the 1,000-yard stare that looked through you rather than at you, registering presence without processing meaning. Let Fern approach first. His voice remained low, directed at Bryn, who'd already started moving toward the storage unit with maternal instinct overriding any tactical consideration. The mother froze, conflict visible across her exhausted features, but Fern was already slipping past her with the confidence of someone who'd navigated this particular crisis before. The 7-year-old dropped to her knees at the storage unit entrance, making herself smaller and less threatening. She didn't call out, didn't reach forward, just began humming something soft and repetitive that sounded like a lullaby, reduced to its most basic melodic structure, notes cycling in pattern that felt more felt than heard. Minutes passed in suspended animation, while everyone in that basement held collective breath. Soren's men maintained perimeter positions, blocking sightlines from curious residents, while creating illusion of privacy in space that had none. Bryn's hands twisted the fabric of her scrubs until knuckles went white, lips moving in what might have been prayer, or simply the desperate internal monologue of a mother watching her child remain unreachable. The humming continued, Fern's small voice steady despite the tremor that had to be running through her body. She inched forward with patience that seemed impossible for her age, each movement telegraphed and slow enough that it couldn't be perceived as threat, just gradual reduction of distance that might eventually register as safe rather than dangerous. A hand emerged from behind the tipped dresser, pale fingers extending with the tentative quality of someone testing whether the world outside their hiding place had transformed into something survivable. The fingers found Fern's knee, gripped the lavender fabric with desperation that communicated everything words couldn't express, relief and terror, and the desperate need for connection that fear had temporarily severed. She needs to be the one who goes in. Soren directed this at Bryn without taking his eyes off the storage unit. Recognizing the particular dynamic playing out in that confined space, the mother nodded through tears that were finally spilling over, understanding on some level that her older daughter needed re-entry into the world to happen through the safest possible channel, her sister's presence rather than overwhelming adult intervention. Fern crawled into the storage unit with the same deliberate slowness, disappearing into darkness until only her shoes remained visible. The humming grew slightly muffled, accompanied now by sounds of movement, and whispered words too quiet to distinguish, but carrying tone that needed no translation. Reassurance, comfort, the specific language that existed between siblings who'd survived things together that created bonds deeper than blood alone could forge. Time stretched in the way it does during crisis, seconds feeling like hours, while everyone waited for signs that connection was being reestablished. Soren remained positioned near the entrance, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough back that his presence wouldn't register as additional threat to a child whose capacity for trust had been catastrophically damaged. When Fern emerged, she was crawling backward while holding her sister's hand, coaxing her forward with continued humming and gentle tugs that were more invitation than demand. The older girl followed with the mechanical quality of someone whose body was moving, while consciousness remained partially elsewhere, still trapped in whatever internal space she'd retreated to when external reality became unendurable. The older girl stood on unsteady legs that had been folded too long in cramped space, her gray hoodie stained with dust and what might have been her own tears. Bryn moved forward finally, arms extending to gather her daughter close, and the embrace that followed carried the weight of 26 hours of imagined worst-case scenarios that hadn't quite manifested, but had come close enough to leave permanent marks on everyone involved. Soren stepped back, creating space for reunion, while his mind was already calculating next movements with the precision of someone who understood that crisis management required thinking 3 steps ahead. His driver appeared at the basement entrance, nodded once in response to unspoken question, confirming that the vehicle was ready for immediate departure should medical intervention become necessary. The older girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder, but made no sound, her body shaking with the kind of silent sobs that somehow hit harder than screaming. Fern pressed against both of them, small arms barely able to encompass her family, creating huddle of 3 that existed in bubble of connection that momentarily excluded the rest of the world. One of Soren's men approached with a bottle of water and a thermal blanket, items produced from the kind of emergency kit that organizations like his maintained because crisis was occupational hazard rather than exception. Bryn accepted both with a grateful nod, her focus never leaving her daughter's face as she checked for injuries with hands that knew exactly where to look and how to assess damage both visible and hidden. The super had retreated to a safe distance, but remained visible, his discomfort obvious in the way he shifted weight from foot to foot. He'd rented this building for 6 years, and probably knew which tenants paid late, which ones had guests that stayed too long, which apartments served as crash pads for people cycling through addiction or poverty or both. But this particular crisis clearly exceeded his capacity for intervention. Mr. Herrera in 3B. Soren's voice cut through the basement's heavy air with edge that made the super flinch visibly. What was his debt? The question wasn't really about money. It was about proportionality, about whether the amount justified the methods his collectors had employed and the collateral damage those methods had generated. The super's throat worked soundlessly for several seconds before words emerged. 3 months' rent, maybe 4. He kept saying his disability check got delayed, that he'd have it next week. His eyes darted toward the stairwell as if calculating whether escape was a viable option, But Soren's men had positioned themselves in ways that made such calculations academic rather than practical. And my men came how many times? The question emerged flat, devoid of inflection, which somehow made it more threatening than if he'd injected anger or judgment into the words. Documentation existed somewhere in his organization's records, but hearing it spoken aloud served different purpose. It forced acknowledgement, created witnesses, established narrative that would inform what came next. 3 times in 2 weeks. The super's voice had dropped to near whisper, as if reducing volume might somehow reduce culpability for having allowed access, for having provided information, for having been complicit through inaction, if not active participation. The last time they broke his lock, went through his things. Soren's jaw tightened with the kind of controlled fury that was more dangerous than explosive anger because it came with calculation rather than reaction. His phone was already out, messages being composed with thumb movements that looked casual but were constructing careful documentation of policy violations that would have consequences extending far beyond this particular incident. Behind him, Bryn had coaxed her older daughter into drinking small sips of water, the girl's hands shaking so badly that liquid sloshed against the bottle's rim. Fern maintained her position pressed against her sister's side, small hand gripping the gray hoodie with determination that suggested she had no intention of allowing separation again, regardless of what adults decided was appropriate or necessary. Who else was affected? The question was directed at the super, but carried enough weight that several other residents emerged from their apartments, drawn by the understanding that something was shifting in the building's power dynamics. An elderly woman in a housecoat, a young man with a baby on his hip, a teenage girl who looked like she'd been crying. They appeared in doorways with the tentative quality of people testing whether it was safe to acknowledge they'd witnessed things they'd been too afraid to report. The super's eyes widened as he registered the implications, understanding perhaps for the first time that this wasn't just about one missing girl or one broken lock. Mrs. Kowalski in 2A, they threatened her grandson. The Nguyens on 5, they went through their apartment when nobody was home. Each admission came harder than the last, as if speaking truth aloud made him complicit in ways that silence had allowed him to avoid. Soren absorbed this information with visible effort at control, his free hand curling into fist, before deliberately relaxing. The renovation project that was supposed to improve lives had apparently been providing cover for systematic intimidation, and the irony of trying to build legitimate reputation while his own people undermined it from within would have been amusing if it weren't so catastrophically short-sighted. Where are they now? He directed this at the man closest to him, one whose job included knowing the location of every person in the organization at any given moment. The response came immediately. Coordinates and current assignment delivered in shorthand that communicated everything necessary without wasting words on unnecessary context. The 3 collectors were currently handling another matter across town, unaware that their previous work was unraveling in ways that would fundamentally alter their employment status. Soren's next message went to someone whose title didn't exist in any official documentation, but whose function was unmistakable. He made problems disappear, sometimes through relocation, sometimes through reassignment, occasionally through methods that required no subsequent explanation. Get them to the warehouse on Trent Avenue. The words carried finality that made even his own men shift uncomfortably. Because warehouse meetings didn't happen for performance reviews or policy clarification, they happened when someone had crossed lines that required the kind of correction that left permanent impressions. I'll be there in 2 hours. Bryn had been listening despite her focus remaining primarily on her daughters, and something in her expression shifted when she heard the destination and time frame. She understood enough about how power operated in Spokane's shadows to know that warehouse meetings didn't end with handshakes and promises to do better next time. They ended with restructuring that was sometimes literal as well as metaphorical. They didn't know. The words emerged from her mouth before conscious thought could intervene, maternal instinct apparently extending even to men who'd terrorized her building and caused her daughter to disappear into a storage unit for 26 hours. They were just doing their jobs. The statement carried no real conviction, as if she felt obligated to offer defense, but didn't actually believe the words she was speaking. Soren's eyes met hers for the first time since they'd entered the basement, and whatever she saw in that gaze made her take an involuntary step backward. Their job is to collect debt, not traumatize children. His voice remained level, almost conversational, which somehow emphasized rather than softened the implicit threat. They failed to make that distinction, and failure has consequences. The ride to Bryn's apartment happened in silence, heavy with unprocessed trauma and unspoken questions. The older girl sat pressed between her mother and Fern, still wrapped in the thermal blanket despite the car's heated interior, her eyes tracking the passing streets with the disconnected quality of someone whose consciousness remained partially elsewhere, still trapped in that dark storage unit where time had stopped and terror had crystallized into something permanent. Soren remained in the front passenger seat, his attention divided between his phone, where messages continued arriving with updates on personnel movements and policy implementation, and the rearview mirror, where he could observe the fractured family trying to reassemble itself into something functional. The driver navigated with the same efficient silence, understanding without being told that this particular transport required delicacy rather than the usual professional detachment. Building 7 on Morrow Street looked different in late afternoon light, the scaffolding casting geometric shadows across facade that desperately needed the renovation Soren had promised. Residents watched from windows as the black sedan pulled up, as suited men emerged and opened doors with deference usually reserved for dignitaries, rather than a woman in cleaning scrubs, and 2 girls whose combined clothing budget probably didn't exceed $50. Bryn hesitated before exiting, her hand on the door handle, but her body language suggesting she was calculating costs and benefits of accepting further assistance from someone whose organization had caused this crisis in the first place. The older girl made the decision for her by sliding across the seat toward the open door, ready to escape the confined space even if destination remained uncertain. 4th floor. Soren's voice carried no inflection, just statement of fact that required no response. He was already moving toward the building entrance, and his men fell into formation that somehow managed to appear protective rather than threatening, despite the obvious implications of their coordinated movements and the way their jackets hung heavy with concealed weight. The elevator was broken, had been broken for 3 weeks according to a handwritten sign taped to the doors, so they took stairs that smelled like industrial cleaner, failing to mask older, more organic odors. Bryn carried Fern, while the older girl climbed with mechanical precision, one hand trailing along the wall as if physical connection to solid surface was necessary to maintain orientation in space that felt increasingly surreal. Apartment 4C's door bore scratches around the lock that told story of previous forced entry, evidence that Bryn had probably reported to landlords who'd done nothing or perhaps done exactly what they were supposed to do, notify the owners that their collector had completed his assignment. The key turned in mechanism that needed replacement, and they entered space that was small and tidy in the way that poverty demanded, because disorder was a luxury that people without resources couldn't afford. 2 bedrooms branched off a main living area, where a couch that had seen better decades faced a television that probably predated flat screens. The kitchen was narrow enough that one person working there created traffic jam, but everything was clean. Everything was maintained with the kind of care that spoke to pride in space, even when space itself was inadequate for actual needs of family, trying to survive on margins so thin that 3 months unpaid rent by a neighbor could trigger cascading catastrophe. Soren remained near the door, while Bryn guided her older daughter toward the bathroom, murmuring about warm showers and clean clothes and normal routines that might help re-establish sense of safety that had been comprehensively shattered. Fern stayed in the living room, watching him with the kind of steady assessment that suggested she was trying to determine whether he represented ongoing threat or temporary ally in crisis that wasn't actually resolved just because her sister had been found. "You can sit." She gestured toward the couch with authority that seemed borrowed from adult interaction she'd observed, as if playing host might create structure in situation that had none. He remained standing, understanding that occupying furniture would transform the dynamic in ways that might not be helpful, that maintaining slight distance preserved boundaries that everyone in this apartment needed. The bathroom door closed with click that seemed unusually loud, followed by sounds of water running, and Bryn's voice offering reassurances that were too quiet to distinguish, but carried tone that needed no translation. Fern moved to the window, pressing her forehead against glass that overlooked the street where Soren's vehicles remained parked with engines running, and drivers maintaining alert observation of surroundings. "She'll be scared for a long time." The statement emerged matter-of-fact, without the kind of childish optimism that might have suggested belief in quick recovery or easy healing. Fern understood on some level that trauma operated on timescales that didn't align with adult desire for resolution, that 26 hours in a storage unit would ripple forward through years in ways that would shape her sister's relationship with enclosed spaces and loud noises and unexpected intrusions. Soren's phone buzzed with confirmation that the 3 collectors were en route to the warehouse, their arrival expected within the hour. His thumb hovered over the screen, composing response that would establish parameters for the conversation that was coming, but Fern's voice interrupted before he could commit words to digital record. What happens to them? She'd turned from the window, and her eyes carried the same steady assessment, calculating whether his answer would align with actions, or whether the gap between words and reality would reveal him as just another adult who promised protection while delivering something else entirely. The men who scared my sister? The question deserved honesty, even if honesty was complicated. They'll be reassigned to positions where they can't hurt anyone else. It was truth, without being complete truth, because reassignment in his organization could mean many things, depending on severity of infraction and willingness to accept correction. What they did violated policies that exist specifically to prevent this kind of situation. Will they get fired? Fern's follow-up came immediately, suggesting she'd been thinking about proportionality and justice in whatever framework a 7-year-old constructed to understand the world's fundamental unfairness. My mom got fired from her last job for being late 3 times because I was sick and she had to stay home. The comparison landed with more weight than she probably intended, highlighting the asymmetry between how power punished small infractions by vulnerable people versus how it handled actual harm caused by those operating with authority's implicit protection. Soren had no good answer that wouldn't sound like excuse or rationalization, so he offered truth that was at least adjacent to what she was really asking. They won't work in residential collections anymore. His voice remained even, neither defensive nor apologetic, just stating outcome that had already been decided in his mind during the drive from the school to the basement, to this apartment. And the policies that allowed this to happen will be changed, so it can't happen again. Fern nodded slowly, processing information with the kind of gravity that suggested she understood he was offering what he could offer, within constraints of systems that were fundamentally broken in ways that couldn't be fixed by single policy change or personnel reassignment. She returned her attention to the window, to the vehicles below that represented power she couldn't fully comprehend, but had learned to recognize as force that could either protect or destroy, depending on how it was wielded and who controlled its direction. The shower stopped, and minutes later, Bryn emerged with her older daughter wearing clean clothes and damp hair, the girl's face scrubbed clean of dust, but carrying exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. They'd been in the bathroom for 20 minutes, which meant Bryn had probably spent most of that time just holding her daughter, creating the kind of physical reassurance that no words could provide, but that bodies understood instinctively when given permission to seek comfort without shame. Soren left the apartment with instructions that sounded like suggestions, but carried weight of non-negotiable directives. Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone. His driver would remain parked outside through the night. Bryn accepted these conditions with the numb compliance of someone whose capacity for decision-making had been exhausted by crisis. Fern watched from the window as the black sedan pulled away toward whatever reckoning awaited 3 men who'd never know a mute girl's name. The warehouse on Trent Avenue existed in the industrial corridor, where Spokane's legitimate economy blurred into its shadow version. The 3 men entered with confidence that evaporated within seconds of seeing Soren's expression. His voice emerged flat when he spoke, emotionless, the tone he reserved for situations where anger would be counterproductive, but clarity was essential. She spent 26 hours hiding in a storage unit. His words came measured, each one weighted with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. The reassignment came with salary reduction and status decrease, the kind of professional humiliation that would be visible to everyone in the hierarchy. New protocols went into effect the following day for all residential operations. No forced entry to occupied units. No confrontations in presence of minors. The specifications continued, each one addressing a gap that the current situation had revealed in procedures designed for efficiency, rather than humanity. 3 days passed before Soren returned to Morrow Street. The building looked the same from outside, but something had shifted in the atmosphere, as if residents sensed that power dynamics had been recalibrated. He found Bryn in the building's laundry room, folding clothes that had clearly been washed multiple times based on their faded colors. She registered his presence with slight stiffening that suggested her nervous system still categorized him as potential threat, despite evidence. How is she? The question required no clarification about which daughter he meant. Bryn's hands paused in their folding motion while she calculated how much truth to share. She hasn't spoken since we found her. The admission came quiet, carrying weight of additional trauma layered onto existing condition. The school counselor says it might take months, or it might be permanent. Soren's mind was already moving toward solutions that money could facilitate. Specialized therapists, trauma-informed care. His phone was already out, composing message to someone whose medical connections could bypass the usual intake procedures. There's a clinic on the north side that specializes in childhood trauma. He spoke while typing, not looking up because eye contact would make this transaction feel more personal than professional. They'll have an opening tomorrow afternoon. Bryn's expression cycled through confusion and suspicion, before landing somewhere adjacent to cautious gratitude. I work second shift tomorrow. The statement acknowledged constraints that rich people rarely had to consider. Your schedule changed. Soren's voice remained matter of fact, delivering information rather than making suggestion. Your supervisor received notification this morning that you're transitioning to first shift. Same pay, better hours. The silence stretched long enough for the laundry room's fluorescent lights to flicker. Bryn's hands had stopped moving entirely, clean clothes forgotten in basket while she processed the implications. Why? The single word contained multitudes. Confusion about motivation, suspicion about hidden costs, the fundamental uncertainty about whether this represented genuine assistance or just more sophisticated form of control. Soren met her eyes for the first time since entering the laundry room. Whatever she saw in his expression must have answered questions she hadn't articulated because her posture shifted fractionally. Because your daughter pulled my jacket and told me the truth when she could have stayed silent. His phone disappeared back into his pocket. And because fixing my organization's mistakes requires more than policy changes. Weeks dissolved into each other with the peculiar quality time takes during recovery periods. Bryn's older daughter began attending the specialized clinic 3 times per week, sessions that remained opaque because therapeutic privacy was apparently sacred. Fern returned to Roosevelt Elementary with the heightened awareness of a child who'd seen adult world reveal its dangerous machinery. Teachers noticed the change, the way she watched doorways and tracked adult movements. Soren's involvement receded to the background, becoming infrastructural rather than visible. The clinic appointments happened without payment discussion. Groceries appeared at irregular intervals. He understood that certain kinds of help worked better when they didn't require acknowledgement. The building renovation actually accelerated once he'd reassigned the collection team. New windows appeared in units that had been drafty. The elevator was finally repaired by contractors who seemed competent. Residents began to relax incrementally, the kind of systemic tension release that happens when threat level drops. Children played in hallways without being immediately called back inside. Conversations in the laundry room lasted longer than strictly necessary. Bryn noticed these changes with the awareness of someone who'd lived in enough unstable situations to recognize genuine improvement. She remained cautious, waiting for the other shoe to drop or the bill to come due. 3 months after that afternoon outside the school, Soren attended a community meeting about the renovation project. He sat through presentations about timeline extensions and budget reallocations with patient attention. Bryn was there with both daughters, seated in the back row where she could exit quickly if necessary. Fern sat between her mother and sister, small hands holding theirs in configuration that created circuit of connection. The older girl's therapist had reported cautious progress. She was eating more regularly, sleeping without nightmares most nights. The verbal communication hadn't returned, but she'd started using sign language taught during therapy sessions. When the meeting concluded, residents dispersed with the shuffling efficiency of people who had other obligations waiting. Soren remained, answering specific questions from elderly residents about accessibility improvements. Fern approached him with the same directness that had characterized their first interaction. She stopped at respectful distance, waiting for him to finish conversation with Mrs. Kowalski before speaking. My sister wanted me to give you something. She extended a folded piece of paper, construction paper, and markers, and the slightly crooked enthusiasm of a child who'd worked hard. She made it in art therapy. Soren accepted the paper with the seriousness it deserved. The image showed a figure in a suit standing next to 2 smaller figures who were holding hands. Above them, drawn in careful letters that had probably taken significant time, were 2 words, "Thank you." The drawing shouldn't have carried the emotional weight it did, but something about the care evident in its creation communicated value that transcended the physical paper. Tell her it's perfect. His voice came rougher than intended, betraying emotion he hadn't quite expected to feel. Tell her I'm keeping it somewhere important. Bryn had approached during this exchange, standing slightly behind Fern with protective positioning. Her expression was unreadable in the community center's fluorescent lighting, but something in her posture suggested she was calculating whether to speak. You didn't have to do all this. The words emerged quiet but firm, acknowledging the infrastructure of help that had materialized around her family. The therapy alone costs more than I make in 3 months. Soren's hands carefully refolded the drawing, tucking it into his inside jacket pocket. I didn't do it for gratitude. The statement wasn't rejection of her acknowledgement so much as clarification of motivation. Then why? Bryn's question echoed her daughter's from months ago. Her eyes searched his face for clues about hidden costs or deferred bills. The answer required honesty that he rarely deployed outside his inner circle. Because your daughter had the courage to tell me the truth when most adults wouldn't. His voice remained level but carried weight. The community center was emptying around them, janitors beginning cleanup routines. Fern had wandered over to examine the bulletin board, giving adults space for conversation that her presence might complicate. Bryn's expression shifted through several configurations before settling into something that wasn't quite acceptance, but was at least recognition. My daughters talk about you like you're some kind of guardian angel who just happens to wear expensive suits. I'm not anyone's angel. The correction came firm but not harsh. I'm someone trying to build legitimate enterprises on foundation of illegitimate practices, and that transition requires demonstrating that my organization can operate without destroying communities. 6 months after a 7-year-old girl grabbed expensive fabric outside Roosevelt Elementary, the building renovation reached completion with understated ceremony. The scaffolding came down section by section, revealing facade that had been cleaned and repaired. Soren attended the final walkthrough with his property manager and contractor. His attention to specifics surprised both professionals accompanying him, as if they'd expected perfunctory approval rather than genuine interest. The school year was ending at Roosevelt Elementary, with usual chaos of field day activities and award ceremonies. Fern had thrived in ways that would have seemed improbable 6 months ago. Her older sister's progress had been less linear, but still evident. She'd returned to school part-time. She was using sign language with increasing fluency. She'd begun sleeping in her own bed. Bryn had been promoted at work, her reliability finally recognized through title change and salary increase. She'd started taking evening classes at the community college, pursuing certification that would eventually qualify her for better positions. The community college courses met twice weekly in buildings that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and filtered coffee from vending machines that charged $3 for beverages that tasted like liquefied cardboard. Her classmates were mostly other women balancing children and jobs, and the desperate hope that education might provide ladder-out-of-service industry wages that never quite covered monthly expenses, even when tips were good. Her notebook for the certification program was filled with careful handwriting, notes taken during lectures when exhaustion made concentration difficult, but determination made quitting impossible. The instructors had noticed her attendance record, perfect despite the juggling act her life required, and one had mentioned scholarship opportunities that might cover advanced coursework if her grades remained consistent through the semester. Fern had started helping with dinner preparation, on nights when Bryn had class, following recipes written in large print and taped to the refrigerator. The older sister would sit at the kitchen table doing homework that came from her special education program, occasionally looking up to sign suggestions about seasoning or cooking times, her contributions growing more confident as weeks passed, and kitchen fires remained hypothetical rather than actual. The apartment had accumulated small improvements that Bryn purchased with discretionary income that finally existed after months of having none: a shower curtain without mildew stains, kitchen towels that matched instead of being random remnants, a small bookshelf assembled from discount store furniture that held library books they were actually reading instead of returning unread, because survival. Elle consumed all available energy. The changes weren't dramatic in the way that movies depicted transformation. Instead, they were incremental improvements that accumulated into something resembling solid ground beneath feet that had been scrambling for purchase. Soren's involvement had faded to background infrastructure. He wasn't present for the small victories, but his absence from these moments was itself a kind of gift. The elementary school scheduled its end-of-year assembly in the newly renovated gymnasium. Parents filled bleachers that didn't wobble, watching children receive certificates for perfect attendance and improved reading levels. Fern's name was called for an award that recognized kindness and courage. She walked across the gym floor in a new lavender dress, while Bryn watched with tears streaming down her face. Soren stood at the back of the gymnasium, positioned where he could observe without being observed. He'd received invitation to the ceremony as one of the donors whose contributions had made the renovation possible. The ceremony continued with comfortable rhythm of school events everywhere. When it concluded, families dispersed toward summer with particular relief that comes from surviving another academic year. Fern found him anyway, navigating through the crowd with determination. She'd grown taller in 6 months, face losing some of the baby roundness while gaining angular definition. She didn't speak immediately, just stood in front of him holding the certificate she'd received. Behind her, Bryn and her older daughter were making their way through the crowd. You came. The observation carried weight beyond its simple words. She understood on some level that he hadn't needed to attend, that his contribution had been financial rather than personal. Soren's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if he'd allowed it to fully form. You earned it. The statement acknowledged both her award and the broader courage she'd demonstrated 6 months ago. Bryn reached them then, her older daughter's hand clasped firmly in her own. The four of them stood in configuration that would have looked unremarkable to casual observers. Thank you for coming. Bryn's voice carried specific warmth of someone who'd moved from suspicion through cautious acceptance. It means something to her that you're here. The older daughter produced a photograph from her pocket, one taken during the ceremony. She offered it to Soren with the same careful attention that had characterized the drawing. Soren accepted the photograph with the same seriousness. I'll keep this safe. The promise was simple but absolute. Another item for the desk drawer. The families were streaming out now, Summer calling them forward. Fern hugged her mother, then her sister, then turned back to Soren with a evaluative look. Will we see you again? The question came with her signature directness. Behind her, Bryn's expression suggested she wanted the same answer, but hadn't allowed herself to ask. When it matters. The words were careful but truthful. When you need help that your mother can't provide and the regular systems won't work, I'll be reachable. Fern nodded with satisfaction. The gymnasium was nearly empty now, just janitors beginning the work of dismantling the assembly setup. Soren moved toward the exit with deliberate pace. At the doorway, he paused to look back at the family standing in the center of the polished floor. Thank you all for following this story. If you're still here, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me keep creating these stories. Until next time.